This is Blanche Monnier. Born on the 1st of March 1849 into a wealthy French merchant family from the city of Poitiers, Blanche was famed for her striking beauty and delicate manner. Naturally, this attracted a great number of potential suitors, some from prominent positions in high society. But Blanche didn't want to marry for money or prestige, and she especially didn't want to spend the rest of her natural life with some beastly brute she barely knew. No, Blanche was in love. Around the age of 25, she had met a lawyer almost 10 years her senior. Despite his practice being a small and modest affair, Blanche was smitten with him. She didn't care if he didn't have the treasury or titles of some of her other potential husbands. She loved him for the nurturing, caring person he was. Yet in 1874, upon finally expressing her desire to marry the man, Blanche discovered her mother's reaction not to be one of joy, but one of disdain and disgust. "No daughter of mine is going to marry some penniless lawyer," Louise Monnier is thought to have said. "You'll wed whomsoever your father and I choose." But Blanche was defiant. She told her mother that she was free to marry whoever she pleased. She wasn't an object to be traded to boost the Monniers' esteem, and if her mother insisted on behaving in such a ghastly manner, she'd have no choice but to elope with her law-practicing lover. That night, once all were asleep, Blanche packed a small traveling case with only a handful of her most precious possessions and attempted her escape. Yet when she reached the bottom of the staircase, she heard a shrill voice pierce the darkness behind her. Going somewhere? It was her mother. Louise had been watching and waiting to apprehend her daughter's attempt to fly the nest, and it turned out she had a rather draconian punishment in mind. What happened remained a closely guarded family secret for the next 27 years, and when the public came to learn of Blanche Monnier's fate, they were horrified by what they heard. To most who know her, Blanche was there one day and gone the next. The sprightly young woman seemed to have just dropped off the face of the earth. Blanche's uncle Marcel, when questioned as to what happened to Blanche, would give the same story as her mother. She ran away, said she was going to live with that lawyer of hers. "We miss her terribly, and we wish she'd come home." But this lawyer insisted he had not seen his beloved Blanche since the day she'd requested to marry him, and placed the blame for her disappearance squarely at the feet of the Monnier family. Her disappearance caused such a concern that a representative of the Poitiers magistrate visited the home to verify Louise Monnier's story. There, they were shown how her armoire had been emptied of clothing, along with a note purported to be written by Blanche herself that referred to eloping with my beloved. This seemed to have satisfied the authorities, and the blame once again shifted to Blanche's paramour. And although he was never formally charged in connection with her disappearance, he insisted on his innocence until his sudden death in 1885. In the years that followed, Blanche was slowly forgotten about as the world moved on without her. Just another victim of class and circumstance in a culture that sees its daughters as little more than property. Then, on May 23rd of 1901, a high-ranking government official in Paris received a frighteningly intriguing letter from an anonymous author. The envelope that was simply marked with the French words, "For Mr. Attorney General," the letter reads as follows: "Dear Sir, it is with the great sorrow that I must inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house in Poitiers, half-starved and living in a putrid litter for the past 25 years, in a word, in her own filth. She is in dire need of assistance, as I fear her health to be in a grave condition. Please help her. Yours." It reads as if whoever had written the letter was just about to sign their name, then decided against it at the last moment. And maybe this is a sign that Madame Monnier's power and influence reach far beyond the regional government of Poitiers. Regardless of her high status, Madame Louise Monnier soon had her lavish home swarmed by French gendarmerie policemen. She demanded to know why they were there, yet the commanding officer simply ignored her, instructing his men to thoroughly search the cellars and attic spaces of the large house. It was then that Madame Monnier realized why they were there. but there was no mad dash to escape, no attempt to hide her crimes. By then, the damage had been done. While searching the attic of the house, police found a small, locked door that they were unable to gain entry to. They demanded that Madame Monnier produce the key, but she told them that she'd misplaced it sometime prior to their unexpected visit. This was of no import to the gendarmerie, who promptly smashed the door off its hinges before squeezing their way into the tiny room of the other side. The sight that greeted them elicited terrified gasps and exclamations from the policemen. They were gendarmerie, military policemen, trained to combat hordes of rioters on the streets of France. They were hard men, ready for anything, but nothing could have prepared them for what waited for them on the other side of that attic door. And this is what they saw. The woman they found had evidently been imprisoned in what can only be described as harrowing conditions. She was weak, on the verge of death, weighing little more than 55 pounds by the time she was rescued. Confined to a small, filthy mattress, the woman was surrounded by pieces of rotten food, pails of urine and stale water, and piles of her own excrement. The carpet and sheets were positively alive with a nightmarish array of parasitic insects, fat from feeding off of the fragile form of the imprisoned woman. One officer described the stench inside the room as unbreathable, and the officers were forced to return with masks in order to continue their grim work. Yet the most shocking discovery of all came when the emaciated woman was asked her name. Officers were so shocked that they asked her to repeat it. "My name," she said, struggling for breath, "is Blanche Monnier." Blanche wasn't dead. Her mother hadn't had her killed as punishment for her escape attempt. Instead, she had been kept prisoner in a small windowless room for almost 30 years. Blanche was rushed to the hospital following her discovery, and while it's certain that doctors managed to save her life, she was never quite the same. She continued to suffer from a number of mental health problems and struggled to adjust to her newfound freedom. Doctors diagnosed her with a variety of debilitating physical conditions, but it has to be mental scarring which Blanche suffered that proves to be the most debilitating. Psychiatrists declared that Blanche showed signs of anorexia nervosa, schizophrenia, exhibitionism, and coprophilia. Her anorexia is somewhat easily explained by the severe food restrictions placed on her, while the devastating isolation she suffered can explain the schizophrenia. But somehow the exhibitionism hits harder than the former pair, because it shows Blanche was so desocialized and damaged by her isolation that she'd forgotten why she had to wear clothes. Nudity wasn't taboo for her anymore, as if she'd somehow become feral as a result of her suffering. The exhibition of coprophilic symptoms are also enough to make even the toughest of us shudder, as the idea of a person driven so mad by hunger that they'd eat their own excrement is perhaps one of the most horrifying concepts imaginable. These severe mental health conditions led to Blanche being admitted to a psychiatric hospital in the central French city of Blois, where she'd eventually died alone and in obscurity in 1913 at the age of 64. Blanche's mother, on the other hand, managed to escape the swift and unforgiving justice she so richly deserved. Shortly after her arrest, she became terribly ill, and a French judge was forced to allow her to remain on house arrest instead of being interred at the city jail. Just 15 days later, after the news of her crimes had circulated among the Pontier peasantry, an angry mob began to gather outside of the Monnier home. It's then that Madame Monnier, upon learning of the vengeful mob, died suddenly as a result of some previously unknown illness. But between you and me, I think it's all too much of a coincidence that Madame Monnier just so happened to pass away in the face of imminent danger, and it's more likely that she took the coward's way out. It was more bad news in the case of her uncle, Marcel Monnier, who, despite being initially convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment, was later acquitted on appeal. Bizarrely, a judge suddenly found Marcel to be mentally incapacitated, and that a duty to rescue was not a statute in the French Penal Code. Therefore, Marcel lacked sufficient grounds to be convicted and was set free. As horrifying though as Blanche's story was, it was almost lost to history for a time before 1930, when French author André Gide published a novel based on the incident. Interest in the case was reignited, and the French people were once again horrified by the story of a mother who was soulless enough to inflict unimaginable cruelty upon her own flesh and blood. Louise Monnier had intended to lock her daughter away from the world until people forgot she even existed. But history has a way of bringing to light what is done in the dark. So now all should know of Blanche Monnier, or as she is known by the French in the early 20th century, La Séquestrée de Pontier, the confined woman of Pontier. Take a look at this picture. It appears to be nothing more than a black and white photograph of some dirty stone steps, probably in a major town or city. But there's a lot more to this seemingly benign picture than meets the eye. You see, the picture was taken towards the end of 1945 in a large Japanese city, and what you're actually looking at are the remains of a victim of one of the most destructive events in human history. It was an event which marked the dawn of a new and terrifying age of atomic warfare. The nuclear bombing of the city of Hiroshima. On August 6th of 1945 at 8:15 a.m., the experimental atomic weapon, codename Little Boy, detonated in the skies over the city. The immediate and devastating destruction caused by the powerful shockwave, as well as the horrendous radiation sickness caused by the subsequent radioactive fallout, are thought to have killed around 70,000 people in just a matter of days. But what proved to be just as horrifying as the huge casualty count were the hauntingly bizarre ways in which people had died, which leads us back to our photograph. According to Japanese scientists, the particular piece of masonry you're looking at is from the entrance steps to the Hiroshima branch of the Japanese Sumitomo Banking Corporation, which was only 2 city blocks away from Ground Zero. At the time the bomb went off, a person must have been sitting on the steps, enjoying the morning sun, possibly enjoying some breakfast before they were due to start a shift or attend an appointment. The intense flash and heat of the nuclear detonation instantly vaporized them, whilst also bleaching the masonry that surrounded them. Essentially what you're looking at is this person's shadow, almost perfectly preserved as their body absorbed the immense energy discharge before dematerializing entirely. According to one historical account, a Japanese soldier charged with hauling a veritable corpse cart through the city streets said he collected remains from outside of Sumitomo Bank. Although it's likely that all he found were pieces of charred bone, because the shadow's owner has never been properly identified and are unlikely to belong to the same person who left the shadow. In the 1970s, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum acquired the stone on which the human shadow had been preserved, beginning intensive research on it in the years that followed. Despite a number of families coming forward to claim that the shadow belongs to a relative of theirs, as of 2016, the museum claims that the shadow most probably belongs to a 42-year-old woman named Mitsuno Koshitomo. But even in light of their intensive research efforts, we'll probably never truly be certain as to the identity of the shadow's owner. What's now known as the Hitokaji no Ishi, or human shadow etched in stone, is now on display at the Peace Museum, which bears its city's name. Visitors can see it for themselves, beholding the horror of atomic warfare with their own eyes, a reminder of the day when something that was once believed to be science fiction became a terrifying reality for people the world over. This is the spire of St. Lambert's Catholic Church in the city of Münster in East Germany. Constructed in the year 1450 with funding from the city's merchant community, the church is a magnificent example of late Gothic architecture, one that the locals are understandably proud of. Even the heathens among us are forced to admit how breathtakingly beautiful it is with its intricately chiseled window fixtures and exquisitely carved ramparts. Yet upon further inspection, it's impossible not to notice the 3 metal cages that seem to be chained to the spire's windows. Could they have served some kind of practical purpose, possibly as some kind of medieval scaffolding to protect the laboring artisans? Or maybe they served some religious significance, some kind of grimdark visual metaphor representing the Holy Trinity. Yet the truth behind these 3 cages is notably horrifying in its practicality, and it all starts with a little rebellion. To put it simply, the Munster Rebellion was an attempt by a group of dissenting Protestants to overthrow the local Catholic governor in the year 1534. Yet given the governor had all the power of the Holy Roman Empire behind him, the rebellion was swiftly put down before its leaders were put to death. These men, John of Leyden, Bernard Knipperdoling, and Bernard Kretsching, were publicly tortured and executed in Munster's large, well-frequented market square. But it stood to reason that an example to others should be displayed for some time, as to demoralize any other would-be rebels. And so it came to pass that the mutilated bodies of the 3 rebel leaders were thrown in the metal cages, hoisted up onto the spire of St. Lambert's, and displayed to all and sundry while the crows picked at their bones. The 3 men's bodies were later removed, but the cages remain to this day. And more recently, the church installed 3 yellow bulbs in each of the cages, representing each of the rebel leaders. These bulbs remain lit from dusk until dawn each night in memory of their departed souls. It's a small gesture of penance from an organization with an undoubtedly tyrannical past. Yet the cages still remind us of a time when dissent and rebellion could land you with one of the worst fates imaginable: to be tortured, murdered, and consumed by carrion crows, all in plain view of all who knew and loved you. Take a look at this picture. What is it you see? Is it a doodle? Something someone scribbled absent-mindedly one day whilst talking on the phone? To the untrained eye, what's scribbled on this piece of paper might well appear to be gibberish, but to the improbable few of us that recognized old German cursive handwriting, they might well be able to make out the 2 words that constitute the entirety of that wall of text: Herzenschatzi and Komm. As it turns out, what you're looking at was intended to be a letter written by a woman named Emma Hauck and addressed to her absent husband. Born in Ellwangen in Germany in August of 1878, Emma was admitted to the psychiatric hospital at the University of Heidelberg after being diagnosed with dementia praecox at the age of just 30 years old. While a patient at the secure facility, Emma wrote a series of highly disturbing and upsetting letters to her husband, often consisting of just a few words repeated over and over again. In the letter you're looking at, she has written the words Herzenschatzi komm, meaning, darling, please come, and then komm, 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 repeated over and over. It's thought that these phrases have been repeated almost 1,000 times on the small piece of paper, and that Emma's husband was extremely upset upon reading the letter, as it was clear that her condition hadn't improved in the least bit since her admission. Emma died on April 1st of 1920, and the hospital staff decided to store her many letters in a rather special place indeed. You see, the University of Heidelberg, where Emma received her treatment, has an entire department dedicated to the artwork produced by its psychiatric patients, known as the Prinzhorn Collection. It's here that Emma's letters were filed away and forgotten about for 80 years, when the Prinzhorn Collection put on an outsider art exhibit in Manhattan, New York City. Once a source of horror and heartbreak for those that knew her, this new generation of artists were fascinated by such candid representations of mental illness. They became the subject of a number of documentary films and were even adapted into a theater play around 2019. Such creative types have managed to put all kinds of spin and interpretation onto Emma's letters, claiming the pieces say more about the person viewing them than they do about Emma herself. But anyone who knows the backstory of such a picture knows that all it speaks is the immense loneliness and suffering of a person who didn't understand what was wrong with her. A person whose sole wish was to be reunited with the man she loved, a man who barely even recognized her anymore, neither physically nor mentally. May she rest in peace. Take a look at this particular photograph. It appears to be nothing more than a preteen girl wearing a tartan dress. On closer inspection, it appears as if her footing is a little shaky. Her hands are raised, as if to maintain balance, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that the little girl is struggling to walk. In fact, it almost appears that she's learning how to walk, like it's one of the first times her emaciated legs have been forced to bear her weight. Yet, that's exactly what's happening, because the girl you're looking at is Genie Wiley, also known as the Feral Child. Born to Clark and Irene Wiley in 1957, Genie grew up in Arcadia, California, where her father worked periodically as an assembly line machinist. Clark was a troubled man, to say the least. His single-parent mother had been a lady of the night, meaning Clark had essentially been raised in a series of brothels, spending long periods of time away from his mother. This had a devastating effect on his psyche, and he grew up to despise the idea of having children. He hated the idea of all the screaming and crying they did, not to mention how expensive they were. So, when Irene broke the news that she was pregnant, he feigned elation and hid his despair. For a short time after Genie's birth, Clark was everything but the doting father. By all accounts, he had seemed overwhelmed by the prospect of being a parent, but the realities weren't half as bad as he'd expected, and the all-consuming adoration he felt for her definitely helped seal the deal. But then, just after Genie's first birthday, Clark got the news that his mother had been killed in a freak car accident. A drunk driver had fallen asleep at the wheel before plowing into her on the freeway. Both sets of remains had been a mess, ruling out the possibility of an open casket funeral, and the way Clark saw it, this robbed him of his final chance to really say goodbye to her. Any man would find that a lot to handle, but to Clark, who had an unhealthy fixation with his mother for as long as he could remember, it broke him. And what followed was a slow descent into madness, sadism, and cruelty that would secure his place amongst the worst child abusers the world has ever seen. As Genie grew up to be a toddler, Clark Wiley was obsessed with the idea that she was somehow mentally deficient. A series of doctors told him that nothing was wrong with Genie, that she was simply developing at her own speed. But Clark wouldn't listen, blinkers of madness and hatred causing him to come to a horrifically evil conclusion. To him, Genie was useless, unfit for interaction with other human beings. Therefore, she should be locked away. He created a blacked-out room in the family house where she would be kept, a room that was little more than a prison cell. For the majority of her young life, Genie was kept chained to a toilet cistern while being restrained with a kind of makeshift straitjacket. Neither Clark nor Irene bothered to potty train the young girl, nor did they see fit to provide her with any formal education. She was so heavily isolated that by the time she escaped in 1970, her grasp of the English language was basic at best. For example, when asked about the kind of abuse she was subjected to at the hands of her father, she said, "Father hit arm, big wood, Genie cry, no spit, father, hit face, spit, father hit big stick, father is angry, father hit Genie big stick, father take piece wood hit, cry, father make me cry." Genie also made it clear that her father used to growl outside of her room, instilling a deep fear of wolves and canines into her that lasted the rest of her life. The abuse lasted day and night, with horrendous punishments for even the most minor infractions. And that's how Genie grew up, for the first 13 years of her life. When she finally escaped, Genie's parents were swiftly apprehended by the police. She was found wandering the streets by a concerned citizen, who promptly took her to social services once the severity of the situation was established. Social workers said that they'd never seen anything like it. A walking skeleton, literally hopping into their office like a bunny rabbit, so emaciated that they were amazed she was alive. Irene Wiley would escape charges due to her being legally disabled, while Clark would take his own life before the cops managed to get cuffs on him. Frighteningly, he left behind a note that simply read, "The world will never understand." When transferred to the UCLA's Children's Hospital, linguist Susie Curtis said Genie was the most profoundly damaged child we had ever seen. She isn't socialized, and her behavior is distasteful, but she just captivated us with her beauty. Until Genie was discovered, it was the commonly accepted scientific consensus that it was essentially impossible to learn a language fluently following puberty. But Genie's thirst for knowledge and ability to learn categorically disproved this. The linguists that worked with her deemed the girl to be surprisingly proficient in both verbal and nonverbal communication. She was smart, Susie Curtis said. She could hold a set of pictures so they told a story. She could create all sorts of complex structures from sticks. She had other signs of intelligence. The lights were on. For some, it raised the question if language is something intrinsically human, a program that's hardwired into us, just waiting to be booted up. It's a tough question, Curtis admitted. It's possible to know very little language and still be fully human, to love, form relationships, and engage with the world. Genie definitely engaged with the world. She could draw in ways that you would know exactly what she was communicating. As of 2008, Genie was in an assisted living facility in the greater Los Angeles area and is reported to be as outgoing and content as she's ever been. Stories like her give us hope. Hope that even those who suffered from unimaginable torment can come back from the brink of utter despair, carving out a life for themselves, an existence, a reason to be, even after someone has tried so hard to take that away from them. How's about this picture? Some of you might recognize the man in the center of the frame as none other than John Lennon of the Beatles, arguably one of the finest songwriters of the 20th century. But do any of you recognize the man next to him? I wouldn't blame you if you don't. After all, neither his face nor his name are particularly remarkable, but his deeds are. You see, the person in the right of the picture is one Mark David Chapman, and just 6 hours after this photograph was taken, Mark would once again approach Lennon on a dark New York City street. Only on that occasion, it was to kill him. On the morning of December 8, 1980, Mark Chapman departed his Sheraton hotel room after deliberately placing a number of choice items on his bed. These were things the police were supposed to find, things he wished to make a statement with. His first act that morning was to buy a copy of the J.D. Salinger novel, The Catcher in the Rye. On the first place he wrote, "This is my statement." Signed, Holden Caulfield. Holden Caulfield is the main character of the novel, someone Mark admitted to being obsessed with, later saying that, "I'm sure the big part of me is Holden Caulfield. The small part of me must be the devil." Mark then spent hours on end lurking outside of Lennon's apartment building, chatting to Beatles fans and trying to blend in. At one point, Mark spotted Lennon's housekeeper returning from a walk with John and Yoko's 5-year-old son, Sean. Mark reached out to shake Sean's hand, telling him he was a beautiful boy, a direct reference to a Lennon song. Finally, just before 11 p.m. that night, John Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, returned to their apartment building after a lengthy recording session. Chapman was waiting for them, but kept his head down until Lennon and Ono had passed. Once he was perfectly framed by an arching entranceway of the apartment building, Chapman produced a .38 revolver from his coat pocket. "Mr. Lennon," he said, in a soft but clear voice, before he dropped to one knee and fired all 5 hollow-point bullets into John's back and shoulder. Each shredded flesh, muscle, and bone in a maelstrom of supersonic destruction, leaving Lennon with a punctured lung and a severed subclavian artery. Mark remained at the scene until the police arrived, and when they did, they found him reading his copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and was taken into custody without a fight. One unit of officers recognized the severity of Lennon's wounds and rushed him to Roosevelt Hospital in their patrol car. But it was no good. John Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival, and a bright shining light of creativity had been snuffed out forever. In the months that followed, an entire team of psychologists and psychiatrists studied Chapman's behavior and mental condition in more than 200 hours of clinical interviews. Half the team concluded that he was acutely psychotic. The other half diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. Mark was also diagnosed with a variety of personality disorders, some of which caused him to disassociate to the point of thinking he was another person. He was declared utterly delusional, yet competent to stand trial, with the experts asserting that although Mark was clearly insane, there was nothing to diminish his responsibility in the murder of John Lennon. However, a philanthropic pastor from Decatur, Georgia, one famous for visiting high-profile prisons, said that he believed that there was some kind of demonic power at work. Charles McGowan had several meetings with Mark during his pretrial detainment, presumably in the hopes of saving another soul whilst conveniently raising his own profile. But Pastor McGowan was horrified to hear that Mark, by his own admission, had killed one of the most famous men in the world, simply to promote the novel, Catcher in the Rye, calling it an extraordinary book that holds many answers. The obsession never dimmed either because, in February of the following year, Mark sent a handwritten statement to the New York Times urging everyone to read The Catcher in the Rye. During his sentencing, Mark was asked if he had anything to say. The courtroom watched as he rose and read a passage from, you guessed it, The Catcher in the Rye. For those familiar with it, it's the part in which Holden tells his little sister Phoebe what he wants to do with his life, and reads as follows. I keep picturing all these little kids playing some kind of game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids and nobody's around. Nobody big, I mean, except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going. I have to come out from somewhere and catch them. And that's all I do all day. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all. So, there it was. That's how Mark saw himself, as saving others from oblivion. But choosing to save them by murdering a mildly egotistical musician from Liverpool, that just speaks to the level of insanity Mark had reached over the years. A judge ordered psychiatric incarceration for a minimum term of 20 years to life. And as of the time of writing, Mark's 12th parole hearing is scheduled for August of 2022. But as Correctional Association lawyer Robert Ganji put it, it's unlikely that he'll ever be freed. The board won't want to risk the heat of releasing John Lennon's killer. But as they say never. So if you ever find yourself sat next to some kindly old Texan and they ask you if you ever read a book called Catcher in the Rye, just smile, nod, and walk away. It might just save your life. On December 10th of 1945, homicide detectives burst into the home of Frances Brown, a murder victim who'd been gruesomely slain in her own Chicago apartment. She was discovered with a knife lodged in her neck and a bullet wound to the head, having been dead for a long time before she was found. Nothing seemed to have been taken from her apartment, but it was evident that Frances's killer had left something behind. A message scrawled on the wall of her apartment in her own lipstick, and this is what it said. For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself. In the course of the investigation that followed, police found a bloody fingerprint smudge on the door jamb of the entrance door. They also interviewed a witness who claimed to have heard gunshots at around 4 o'clock in the morning, as well as talking to the building's night clerk, who said a large, nervous man of about 35 to 40 years old got off the elevator and left the building shortly after the shots were fired. This information led them to 17-year-old William Herons. On June 26, 1946, 17-year-old William Herons was arrested for attempted burglary. Although insistent of his innocence, Herons would make 2 full confessions to 3 separate murders, including that of Frances Brown. On September 4th, Herons admitted his guilt on burglary and murder charges, then tried to hang himself in a prison cell. This wildly contradicts Herons' original statements that he was only going to confess to the murders in order to save himself from the electric chair. Why take the years to save your skin, then try to take your own life immediately after pleading guilty? It's entirely possible that Herons simply realized he couldn't do the time and tried to escape an unjust punishment. It's more likely that the despair of knowing he was caught had set in, and with one of his victims being a 6-year-old child, he knew his imprisonment would be rough, to say the least. In light of Herons' repeated claims of his innocence, no true motive has ever been established for the murders. But the photograph we're looking at may well provide a terrifying insight into Herons' mentality at the time of the killings. Maybe some people really are just consumed with the urge to kill, and maybe it's a craving as tangible as regular people's need for love, friendship, fulfillment, and satisfaction. Maybe for people like William Herons, killing is the only way they can achieve any kind of emotional release. And what's particularly horrifying about his case is that it seems he was completely self-aware of his nightmarish predicament. He wanted to stop killing. He just couldn't control himself. This is a photograph of a Spanish father and daughter, taken by fellow tourists on the afternoon of August 15, 1998, in the small town of Omagh in Northern Ireland. It's a disarmingly peaceful and sunny afternoon. Crowds have gathered in the streets to spend their Saturdays shopping and socializing, and we get the impression that there was a good feeling in the air that day. Some of us might notice all the hallmarks of late 90s technology, fashion, and vehicle design, as our eyes are drawn to the rather dull-looking red car on the right-hand side of the picture. But as it turns out, this exceedingly plain-looking Vauxhall Cavalier is the most significant thing in the photograph, as its contents were just seconds away from changing countless lives forever. 2 days prior, the maroon Vauxhall was stolen from outside of an apartment block in Carrickmacross, a small town over the border in the Republic of Ireland. The men who stole it replaced the Irish license plate with a British one, before driving it over the border to a safe house in County Tyrone. From there, it was then driven onto Omagh's Market Street, a busy commercial hub at the eastern edge of the town center. The driver had intended to park it outside of Omagh's courthouse, but since he couldn't find any parking and was desperate to get out of the stolen vehicle, he was forced to park up on Market Street, right next to throngs of carefree shoppers. But the driver was desperate to abandon the vehicle for another reason entirely, because loaded into the trunk was around 500 pounds of fertilizer-based explosives. He was driving a car bomb, one of ferociously destructive power, and instead of parking it outside the courthouse, the intended target, the IRA bomber had chosen to park it where scores of civilians, both Catholic and Protestant, were strolling along, enjoying a sunny weekend. Instead of waiting for a parking space or simply calling off the operation, the 2 IRA men responsible for detonating the 500-pound bomb just set their timer, then walked away. Just short of 40 minutes later, the 2 Spanish father and daughter tourists approached the car to have their picture taken. Seconds later, the bomb detonated. The force of the explosion shredded the vehicle's metal frame, turning it into deadly shrapnel. The shockwave of the blast did the same thing with all the glass, masonry, and metal in the immediate vicinity, turning everyday objects and fixtures into deadly hailstorms of razor-sharp shards. The bomb even destroyed nearby water pipes, causing water to flow down the street and pavements. This water then mixed with the blood of the dead and dying, creating a horrifying rivers of blood effect that's said to haunt survivors even to this day. 21 people who had been standing near the bomb were killed immediately, with 8 more passing away later on in hospital. But in spite of all the pain and suffering and death that occurred that day, despite the already tragic loss of life, some small miracle occurred that day in Omagh. The Spanish father and daughter, the 2 who were standing there just feet away from a 500-pound car bomb, they survived. For the life of me, I can't seem to find out what their names are or where exactly they're from in Spain, but there are many reports of them miraculously surviving the blast. A number of suspects were identified and arrested in connection with the bombing, but no one ever received a full criminal conviction or properly shouldered the blame for the pointless and bloody massacre. So, it's very possible that the men who built and planted that bomb have seen this picture. It's possible that they know all too well the hurt and suffering they've caused. Every single person in that picture is a potential victim, the last moments of their life having been frozen in time, just seconds before disaster. This is Tereska. The picture was taken in 1948 by photographer David Seymour during his time working as a special correspondent for the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, more commonly known as UNICEF. It was during a visit to a school for backward and psychologically upset children in Warsaw, Poland, that David stumbled across Tereska. Tereska's father had been a prominent member of the Polish resistance during World War II. Following the failure of the Warsaw Uprising, he was subjected to unimaginable torment at the hands of the German secret police before being condemned to a death camp. Without his support, his wife and 2 young daughters were destitute. Towards the end of the war, when Warsaw was bombed into oblivion by the Luftwaffe, Tereska's family's home was completely leveled, and she lost even more members of her extended family when Ukrainian SS volunteers picked over the survivors. Thankfully, the then 4-year-old Tereska survived the massacre by fleeing with her older sister, but it was a case of out of the frying pan into the fire for the 2 poor sisters. They had survived certain death at the hands of the Nazis, only to find themselves wandering the war-torn Polish countryside, where it was easier to catch a bullet than find food. And they did so, being almost constantly on the move for almost a month. At the time of the photograph, psychologists at the children's home Tereska lived in said the event had a profound and indelible effect on her. Even years after the war, when food in Poland was relatively plentiful, Tereska maintained what we might call a famine mentality. She hoarded food, stole it from other children, and responded extremely aggressively when others tried to take it from her. Tereska ate much faster and in much greater quantities than every other child in the orphanage, and her behavior caused much distress to the other staff and children. She was obviously an extremely damaged child, but just how damaged would become evident when Tereska was asked to draw things. When Tereska arrived at the school, she was painfully shy and a reserved child who rarely spoke to teachers or students. But one thing she did seem keen on was drawing. It's likely that Tereska used drawing as a way of temporarily escaping the horrors she'd suffered during the war. And although she was notoriously uncooperative with the school's staff, the one thing they could rely on her to do when asked was to draw. The school psychologist saw an opportunity. Tereska's favorite objects were things like flowers or animals, but psychologists realized that if they asked her to draw other things, which she was more than willing to do, it could provide an insight into the way she viewed the world. The psychologist put together a list of basic, everyday things or phrases for Tereska to draw. One of these was "To jest dom," or in English, "This is home." Tereska had easily completed most of the other drawing assignments, but when asked to draw home, she seemed to be curiously stumped. She simply stared back at the blank blackboard for a moment, as if the very concept itself puzzled her. Then, with chalk in hand, she reached up and drew a rough square before adding what we can safely assume is a chimney on top. She then drew a large circle mounted atop an oval, her commonly used representation of a human being, but after this, Tereska became once again lost in thought. She showed no sign of visible distress, but instead of adding any more details to the picture, Tereska simply began to scribble on it. Her scribbling intensified in speed and force until she was looping the chalk over the picture in a frenzy. While she was scribbling, the photographer softly called out her name, and when Tereska turned to look at him, he snapped her picture. What's truly horrifying is that Tereska evidently grasped the concept of home, But she was so traumatized by the destructive terrors of the Nazi war machine that her idea of home was intrinsically bound to the concept of chaos, ugliness, and destruction. It would be years until Tereska had the linguistical ability to share her wartime experiences with her peers, but through the medium of artwork and creative expression, Tereska was able to communicate all the pain and suffering she'd endured, just with a few random scribbles. This photograph is of 18-year-old Michael McQuilkin and his 12-year-old brother Sean. Taken on August 20th of 1975, the two boys had joined their family on a trip to California's Sequoia National Park. Upon arrival, they decided to climb Morro Rock, a huge 250-foot-tall granite dome rock formation that has a hiking stairway cut into it. When they reached the top of the rise, they found the views to be nothing short of breathtaking. But they also found that something curious was happening with their hair. As you can see, the boy's hair is beginning to stand on end, in a way that's highly reminiscent of the effect static electricity has. In fact, that's exactly what was happening. The level of static electricity in the air around them was so intense that their hair was standing on end. In their ignorance, the boys just thought this was funny, and began taking pictures of themselves and their sister, documenting the strange phenomenon for posterity. 18-year-old Michael looks thoroughly amused by the occurrence, yet his younger brother has a faint look of anxiety about him, and Sean is right to feel anxious, because seconds later, the brothers remember a flash of white light and a deafening explosion, all before each of them experienced the feeling of weightlessness. They had been caught in a lightning strike, one that had hit them with such force that they'd been sent flying through the air. Michael remembers the moment he opened his eyes, the rush of euphoria from knowing he was still alive, followed by the fear of what had become of young Sean. But when he brought himself up to his knees and looked around, all he saw was Sean lying there, smoke billowing from his back as if engulfed by a flameless fire. Miraculously, both boys survived the lightning strike, but suffered third-degree burns and extensive scarring as a result. Yet as horrendous as the scarring was, there was the problem of the mental scarring that would go undetected for years. There is extensive evidence that being struck by lightning can damage a person's central nervous system to the point that they experience intense depression as a result. A combination of post-traumatic stress and nerve damage can leave a survivor particularly susceptible to debilitating mental health problems, including ideations of taking their own life. Which is exactly what claimed young Sean's life in the end. Sean struggled with an intense depression that many believe stemmed from the lightning strike and would go on to take his own life as an adult. It's chillingly clear that the lightning strike might well have contributed to this, and truly terrifying to contemplate that, although the strike didn't kill him outright on that overcast August day, the lightning claimed its victim in the end. On a balmy spring morning in 1954, Los Angeles-based photographer John L. Gaunt was tending to the front lawn of his Hermosa Beach home when he heard a shout coming from his neighbor's place. John walked over to the fence, peering over to be greeted by a cry of, "John, something's happening down on the beach." Being the compulsive documentarian that he was, John ran through his house, grabbing his camera on the way back to the beach. There, striding up and down the surf as if in desperation, were Mr. and Mrs. John McDonald. John instantly recognized that something was horribly wrong. It was something about the looks in their faces, something about the way they clung to each other as if gripped by a frantic despair, and the way they kept looking off into the water suggested that someone was either in the process of drowning or had succumbed already. Some might say it was an overly intrusive move, but John's instincts kicked in and he took the photograph that you see before you. It was only later, after he'd had the film developed, that he learned why exactly the couple had appeared so horrified, and it was something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Around 10 to 15 minutes before John emerged onto his back patio, The McDonalds had been watching their 18-month-old son playing along the shoreline. Then suddenly, a freak wave crashed over the helpless child, pulling him out into the surf and, ultimately, to his doom. John named the photograph Tragedy by the Sea, and it appeared on the following day's edition of the Los Angeles Times. Both the picture and the story proved to be a national sensation as parents everywhere sympathized with the desperate, heartbroken McDonald family whose son had been so cruelly snatched away from them. The following year, the image would earn John a Pulitzer Prize for press photography, with a committee praising the piece as poignant and profoundly moving. But to John, taking that photograph proved to be just as much a burden as it was a boon. You see, the McDonalds were neighbors of John. They had been for years prior and remained so for years after. He didn't know them personally, but he knew them in passing, and each time he bumped into Mr. or Mrs. McDonald in the grocery store, or on the beach or at a neighborhood barbecue, he was reminded that he had shown the entire world a window into the single most painful moment of their lives. In his 2007 obituary for the LA Times, John's daughter wrote that the image was hard for him to bear, and even though the McDonalds forgave him for taking the picture, I don't think he ever managed to forgive himself. Take a look at this one. No, it's not the latest member of Slipknot. And nope, it's not some obscure cosplay for some manga series. The mask you're seeing actually belonged to a man named Edward Paynell, perhaps better known as the Beast of Jersey. Now, we're not talking Jersey like Tony Soprano's Jersey. We're talking Jersey, just Jersey, the largest of the English Channel Islands. With a population of just 107,800, Jersey is actually more like its own country, and despite the fact that the British government are bound to defend it in the event of a military invasion, Jersey is actually a tiny self-governing microstate, a little piece of Englishness less than 15 miles from the French coast. And it's this tiny, rather unique place that became the hunting grounds of Edward Paynell. Between the years of 1960 and 1971, Paynell regularly snuck out at night, wandering the streets of Saint-Hélier in search of potential prey. Once he found a house he believed to be vulnerable or undefended, he would break in as silently as he could, then ambush women and children in their beds. To obscure his identity whilst committing the most heinous acts of venal abuse, Paynell would wear the same rubber mask you're looking at now, along with a pair of nail-studded wristlets. These were designed to prevent a person from fighting back during his attempts to overpower them, lest they be punctured by the 2-inch-long razor-sharp nails. He did this night after night, over and over for years on end. After his arrest in 1971, Paynell was convicted on 13 accounts of serious indecent assault, but even the most conservative estimates put the true number of attacks at a considerably higher number. Even so, the convictions earned him a 30-year conviction, and for a while, the island of Jersey was safe once again. His defense didn't have a leg to stand on either, as Paynell was caught whilst in possession of his rubber mask and wristlets. It was while being questioned on the reasoning behind the costume that Paynell revealed that he adopted a kind of alternate persona while wearing it. Once it was donned, it was no longer simply Edward Paynell. Instead, he became the Beast. And how's about this photograph? To many, it might simply look like an old-fashioned picture of some men at the movies, and, in a way, that's exactly what you're looking at. Yet when you learn who these men are, and what movie they're watching, the photograph takes on a rather chilling significance. You see, these men are German prisoners of war, and the film they are watching is footage of Nazi atrocities committed upon defenseless ethnic minorities. It's quite clear that many of them either had no idea such horrors were even occurring, or that they couldn't handle seeing the realities of them. Yet even more chilling are the men who stare blankly at the movie screen. In the face of such despicable crimes against humanity, they are remorseless, They knew what they were signed up for and are unrepentant in the face of it. Perhaps we'll never really know how lucky we are that the Allies won. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And be sure to check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts, all links down below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.